The stage was set for a night of intense discussion on American Perspectives Tonight, a primetime show known for its sharp political and cultural debates. Under the bright studio lights, Karoline Leavitt sat with unwavering poise, ready for yet another challenge. Across from her was Alan Brooks, a veteran journalist infamous for his relentless questioning and sharp-edged critiques. Millions of viewers tuned in, anticipating not just another debate, but a defining moment. The conversation was marketed as a discussion on leadership and policy, but both the audience and the participants knew it would evolve into something deeper. Karoline had earned a reputation as a fearless advocate, standing firm on her principles and articulating her views with clarity. Alan, on the other hand, was known for dismantling his guests' arguments, pushing them into uncomfortable corners. For the first 20 minutes, the exchange was standard political discourse, economic policies, government regulations, and social issues. Karoline answered with confidence, demonstrating her ability to connect with viewers beyond the studio walls. But then, something shifted. Alan adjusted his posture, a subtle movement that only a seasoned debater would recognize. His expression hardened, his voice took on a measured tone, the energy in the room changed. He was about to pivot. The discussion was no longer just about politics, it was about faith, and everyone knew this was where the real debate would begin. The air in the studio grew heavier, the shift almost imperceptible but undeniable. Alan Brooks, ever the seasoned interrogator, leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Karoline's with a calculated intensity. He was done with the predictable policy talk. Now, he was ready to strike. "Karoline," he began, his voice smooth but edged with challenge. "You often speak about your faith as a guiding principle in your leadership. You've even suggested that faith should play a role in shaping public policy." He paused, watching for a reaction. Karoline remained composed, waiting. Alan continued, his tone sharpening. "But let's be honest. Religion, Christianity in particular, is declining in this country. Fewer people believe in a higher power than ever before. Science has given us answers that faith never could. And yet, you continue to advocate for faith as if it's some universal truth. Why?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Karoline didn't flinch. She had been in tough conversations before, but this was different. Alan wasn't just questioning her personal beliefs. He was challenging the very relevance of faith itself. He pressed further, his words like a blade cutting through the air. Millions of Americans would argue that faith is nothing more than an outdated crutch, something that holds people back rather than moves them forward. Are you willing to admit that faith is losing its place in modern America? The room tensed. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of expression, every shift in posture. Alan had thrown down the gauntlet. The question wasn't just about belief. It was about the soul of a nation. For a long moment, Karoline said nothing. Then she took a slow breath, tilted her head slightly, and gave the faintest of smiles. She wasn't caught off guard. She was ready. And she knew exactly what to say next. The silence that followed Alan's challenge was deafening. The audience held their breath, the tension in the room so thick it was almost tangible. Alan had played his hand. His words had been razor-sharp, his delivery calculated. He had framed faith as obsolete, a relic of the past, and now he waited, expecting Karoline to struggle, to grasp for words that couldn't stand up to his logic. But Karoline didn't rush. Instead, she let the question settle, absorbing its weight. Then she leaned forward slightly, mirroring Alan's intensity, but with a calm that made the moment even more electric. "You say faith is an outdated crutch," she began, her voice steady, unwavering, "that it holds people back. But let me ask you something, Alan." She paused, her gaze locked onto his. "What do people turn to when science doesn't have an answer?" Alan's lips twitched, but he said nothing. She continued, her voice soft yet commanding. "It's easy to dismiss faith when life is comfortable, when everything is going according to plan. When your career is thriving, when your family is healthy, when the world still makes sense. But what happens when the ground beneath you disappears? When your child is dying in a hospital bed? When you're standing at a graveside staring at a casket? When the doctor says there's nothing more we can do, what do you reach for then? The silence in the studio wasn't just a pause, it was a shift. Even the crew, usually focused on their tasks, seemed frozen in place. Alan adjusted his tie, a flicker of something, hesitation, crossing his face, but he wasn't ready to back down. People turn to faith because they're desperate, he countered. That doesn't make it real, that makes it comforting. Karoline nodded slightly, as if she had expected that very response. Comfort isn't weakness, Alan. It's human. And faith is more than just comfort. It's resilience. It's hope. It's the belief that even in the darkest moments, there's still meaning. You can call that naive, but I'd argue it's what has kept people from collapsing under the weight of suffering for thousands of years. Alan exhaled, shifting in his chair. He had been prepared for statistics, for ideological arguments. He hadn't been prepared for this. Alan exhaled sharply, tapping his pen against the desk. He had spent years dismantling arguments, pushing opponents into corners they couldn't escape. But this was different. Karoline wasn't just debating, she was shifting the very foundation of the conversation. He forced a smile, shaking his head slightly. So you're saying belief is necessary for survival? Karoline didn't hesitate. I'm saying belief is what makes survival worth something. The response was like a spark in a dimly lit room, sudden, unexpected, and impossible to ignore. Alan blinked as if recalibrating his approach. He was searching for an opening, a flaw, but Karoline was unshaken. All right, he said, regaining his edge. Let's talk facts. Religious institutions have been responsible for some of the worst atrocities in history. Wars, oppression, corruption. And yet, you defend faith as if it's only ever been a force for good. Karoline didn't flinch. I won't deny that people have done terrible things in the name of religion, but let's be fair. Faith has also been the foundation for some of the greatest acts of courage, sacrifice, and kindness the world has ever seen. She leaned in slightly. The abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, the countless hospitals, schools, and charities started by people who believed their faith called them to help others. You can't erase that, just because some have twisted faith for their own agendas. Alan's jaw tensed. He didn't have an immediate retort. Karoline saw the opening, and this time she took it. But if you really want to know why I believe in faith, why I defend it, it's not because of history. It's not because of politics. She paused, her voice lowering just slightly. It's because of a woman I met 12 years ago. Alan's brow furrowed. The audience leaned in. No one, not Alan, not the viewers, not even the producers, was prepared for the story she was about to tell. The room was silent. Alan, usually quick with a rebuttal, simply watched as Karoline's expression softened, her voice taking on a quieter, more deliberate tone. 12 years ago, she began, I was fresh out of college working as a legislative assistant in Nashville. My world was politics, meetings, policy discussions, drafting statements. I believed that laws and leadership were the most powerful forces in the world. She paused, her fingers lightly interlacing on the table. And then I met Margaret. Alan's posture stiffened slightly. He wasn't sure where this was going, but something in the way she spoke kept him locked in. She was 72 years old. I met her at a community outreach event, one of those that politicians love to show up to for a quick photo op. I wasn't there for that. I was just doing my job, taking notes, listening politely. But Margaret, she stopped me in my tracks. Karoline let out a small breath, as if the memory itself still carried weight. She had a presence, not because she was loud or forceful, but because she carried herself with a quiet strength, the kind that only comes from surviving things that should have broken you. Alan didn't look down at his notes. He wasn't analyzing anymore, he was listening. She lost 2 sons, one to cancer, one to a drunk driver. She lost her husband to a stroke. She had no siblings, no close family left. And yet she sat across from me, smiling, sipping tea, asking how my life was going. Caroline's voice tightened just slightly. I remember asking her how she did it, how she could endure so much loss and still sit there, warm and kind, as if the world hadn't tried to take everything from her. She looked directly at Alan now, and what she told me that day changed everything. Alan didn't move. No one in the studio did. The weight of Caroline's words hung in the air, pulling everyone into the moment. Even the cameras, normally scanning for reactions, seemed locked in place. Caroline took a slow breath. I asked Margaret how she endured it all, how she could lose so much and still sit there, still find reasons to smile. She swallowed, her voice steady but laced with something raw. She looked at me, this young woman who thought she had the world figured out, and said something I will never forget. She let the silence stretch, drawing the audience in. Faith isn't about proof, she finally said. It's about what keeps you standing when there is no proof. Alan's fingers, still resting on his pen, tapped once against the desk. He opened his mouth slightly as if to respond, but no words came out. Caroline continued, her voice softer now. Margaret told me that every morning she woke up and thanked God, not because her life had been easy, not because she had been spared from suffering, but because she was still here, because even after everything, she believed there was still purpose in the day she had left. The room felt impossibly still. Alan exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He had come prepared for facts, for ideological clashes, for statistics that could challenge belief. But how did you argue with something like this? You see, Alan, Caroline said, her voice unwavering, faith isn't just something people turn to when they're desperate. It's what keeps them from falling apart. It's not about ignoring reality. It's about finding the strength to face it. Alan sat back, his usual confidence tempered by something else. Something that hadn't been there before. For the first time that night, he wasn't debating. He was thinking. Alan's mouth remained slightly open, as if he had something to say but couldn't quite shape the words. The weight of Caroline's story lingered in the air, pressing down on everyone in the studio. The audience, normally quick to react, was frozen. No whispers, no shifting in seats. Even the host, who usually kept the debate moving, hesitated. Caroline didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch, let the meaning of her words settle. She could see it in Alan's expression. He was searching for a response, but this wasn't a typical political argument. He wasn't just facing a counterpoint, he was facing something deeper. Finally, Alan cleared his throat. That's a powerful story, he admitted, his voice quieter than before. But don't you think it's just that, a story? Margaret found something that worked for her, but that doesn't mean faith is a universal truth. Caroline nodded as if she had expected that response. You're right about one thing, she said. Faith isn't about proving something to other people. It's about what people live through, and if you listen, really listen, you'll hear that story told a million different ways. Alan exhaled, rubbing his temple. But that's my issue, Caroline. Faith isn't measurable, it's built on emotions, experiences, things that can't be qualified, and yet people use it to justify decisions that affect everyone. Caroline tilted her head slightly. You mean like hope? Alan blinked. Hope? She leaned in. Hope isn't measurable. It isn't scientific. You can't put it under a microscope. And yet, people fight wars for it. They survive the impossible because of it. They hold on to it even when logic says they shouldn't. Alan's fingers tapped against the desk. He had been expecting a debate, but what he had walked into was something else entirely. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't have an immediate answer. Alan shifted in his chair, his usual sharpness dulled by something unfamiliar. Reflection. He had spent years dismantling arguments, exposing contradictions, forcing his opponents to defend their beliefs under relentless scrutiny. But this wasn't an argument. It was something else entirely. The host, sensing the shift, finally spoke. Alan, do you have a response to that? Alan opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced toward the audience as if searching for something, some reaction to ground himself, but no one moved. The energy in the room had changed. What had started as a debate had transformed into something deeper, something raw and unshakable. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual edge. I think I need to process that." A murmur rippled through the audience. It wasn't the dramatic takedown they had expected. It wasn't an explosive moment of victory or defeat. It was something far rarer, a moment of honesty. The debate wrapped up minutes later, but the conversation was far from over. As the cameras cut, there was no immediate rush to applause, no quick exit from the crowd. People lingered, exchanging glances, whispering, not out of disinterest, but because they had felt something. Alan removed his mic and walked toward the exit, his posture stiff, his mind clearly elsewhere. He didn't stop for small talk or post-show commentary. Instead, he disappeared through the backstage doors without another word. Karoline, however, remained seated. She could hear the whispers from the crew, see the way people looked at each other, some moved, some unsettled, but none unaffected. And then her phone buzzed. The first ripple of what would soon become a tidal wave had just begun. In life, we will always face challenges, ranging from doubt and criticism to situations that force us to defend our beliefs. As Karoline Leavitt has demonstrated, strength does not lie in arguing to win, but in standing firm in one's convictions and the ability to inspire others. Stay calm and confident in the face of doubt. There will always be people who try to dismiss your value, but the key is to not let them control the conversation. When someone questions your beliefs or principles, respond calmly and confidently rather than reacting defensively. Don't just argue with logic, reach people's hearts. Reason can convince the mind, but stories and emotions touch the soul. When defending something important, tell a story, share real experiences, just as Karoline did with Margaret. It doesn't just change the conversation, it changes how others think. Truth is more than just numbers, it's lived experience. Not everything meaningful can be measured or scientifically proven. Hope, faith, and resilience cannot be placed under a microscope, yet they have the power to lift people up during their hardest moments. Listen more, react less. Sometimes victory doesn't come from having the sharpest response, but from making others think. A debate doesn't always have to end in overpowering or refuting the opponent. Sometimes, simply leaving them with a thought-provoking question is enough. Stand firm in your values, but don't force them on others. Being steadfast doesn't mean being stubborn. It means holding on to your beliefs while remaining open to listening and understanding others. Give people the space to reflect, rather than forcing them to accept your perspective immediately. Change happens through authenticity and conviction. Just as Karoline made Alan reconsider his prejudices, we can all create change, not by imposing our views, but by expressing them with sincerity and unwavering conviction. Ultimately, just as Karoline made Alan reconsider his preconceived notions, each of us can create change not by imposing our views, but by presenting them with sincerity and conviction.